So what's needed for implementation? There's a huge and growing literature on all the steps necessary for adaptation planning. I think it's important to start with measuring and documenting what's already happened. What was the extent and duration of extreme weather events? What were the physical impacts? What were the economic impacts? Those are the data we have to work with and going to be really important. The projected future impacts come from climate scenarios. And what's important, I've talked about stakeholder engagement, they need to be there up front. What we don't want to see, and we too often see, climate scientists run the numbers, and some policy analysts tell you that, here's the measures, and then give it to decision makers. You might have developed outputs that aren't meaningful or practical for the decision maker. So having the decision makers in, and community groups and private sector up front is important for defining scenarios, also for managing expectations. We're not going to get all the answers out of these magic models. There's going to be a lot of discussions, there's going to be some tough calls. But doing those future climate impacts, assessing vulnerabilities, which includes sort of a physical modeling aspect, as well as discussions about how do we define critical infrastructure? Where are the sort of the pressure points? What are the assets that we might protect first? Evaluating resilient strategies, obviously their effectiveness, their costs and benefits, engaging available resources. Okay, here's a beautiful plan and everything we could do, and we should do. What can we actually do with existing resources as we move towards implementation opportunities? As I noted, the challenges can be analytical, they can be economic, and they can be kind of institutional, legal, like we heard about in terms of FEMA. But also, what I find often within the same city department or corporation, there can be some cultural differences. The people working on hazard mitigation and emergency response are different than the people working on policy and long-term planning. And they have a lot to learn from each other. You may have multiple city agencies working on green infrastructure, not necessarily in a coordinated way. And so bringing together these stakeholders to define priorities is key. And again, assessing capacity and resources, given we all have limited funds to invest. Or if some of you don't, then I'll talk to you after. So we did this workshop 2 years ago for NOAA on climate adaptation and transportation information and assistance needs. Myself and with EESI, Jan Mueller and John Michael Cross there, bringing together federal, state, local transportation experts, private sector, to really focus in on the kind of the capacity building, the information needs. How do you equip practitioners to be able to respond? One of the most interesting findings that I found was that, and it was interesting because we were dealing, I won't name any names, but there were some transportation departments putting significant funding into climate model downscaling because they really wanted to get that third decimal point for their area. And it turns out that local non-climate information could be as valuable or more valuable than the climate information coming out of the models. As Jeff Williams at the Entergy Corporation, the utility down in New Orleans says, are we ready for the current climate? How resilient is our infrastructure? So then issues of state of repair, elevation of infrastructure become very important. And on the one hand, while that's daunting, great, there's all this other stuff we need to do. Wait a minute, we know that. We can document that. We can look at, when was the last storm event? Where is the soil saturation? Where are river flows? That type of information is going to be really important for resilience planning. There's some improved climate and weather products, and I'm obviously just giving some examples, reports online. These precipitation intensity, duration, and frequency curves need to remain up to date, but also to be this NOAA Atlas 14 designed in a way that reflects climate scenarios is going to be important for planners and engineers. Similarly, updating flood maps to reflect climate change. Sea level rise is easy, right? I mean, there's some range. You get into storm surge, it becomes much more complicated, but brings much higher risks. So those types of applied information products are going to be important. Communication, folks in the room mentioned a need to, so many different websites to go to. Where do I get the data? Where do I get the information? Where do I find out which models to use? As we call it, who are you going to call? So is there a sort of central clearinghouse or place to get this information to start the discussion? More and better tools. Here's the goal. Climate adaptation and decision making need to be integrated into existing processes. It's great to have the plan. You need the plan, but if it's not connected to if your adaptation plan is not connected to your capital plan or to other regulatory requirements, implementation is probably going to be slower. And so there's need for technical assistance on scenario planning, different climate and land use scenarios, guidance on threshold analysis, guidance on how do you figure out the timing? Is this something I have to decide in 2 years, or can I wait 20 years in terms of this replacing this piece of coastal infrastructure? That's really important to know. Obviously, costs and benefits are quite important, and as we look multi-sector, becomes both richer and more complicated to do. Managing risk and uncertainty is an area where there's need for assistance. And one question I often ask is, when are directionally correct measures appropriate and sufficient? Again, a piece of coastal infrastructure, you want the best possible information. I think it was the Deer Island sewage treatment plant here in Boston more than a decade ago. Looked at sea level rise, let's build that thing high enough so we don't have to worry about it. But if there's something where you're trying to do that extra modeling to find out, is going to be, how wet is it going to be? At a certain point, the difference between 3.1 inches per hour of rain and 3.8 inches of hour goes beyond the ability of our ability to fine-tune our adaptation strategies. So some things, maybe, let's do some stuff that's directionally correct, and then let's measure it, and let's see how it's working, and see how effective it is. Some of it we just don't know. Research needs, we'll talk about a little bit later. Stakeholder engagement is a place that I focused a lot of my career. As I started this talk, trying to present images of what does a problem look like, what are the solutions that we can grasp. Not everything is pretty or common sense and compelling, but if there are compelling common sense solutions, let's keep those in mind. And then looking at, okay, but what do stakeholders really care about? Where's their economic self-interest? Chuck Hujan and I, in Growing Wealthier, put together this matrix which said, for different stakeholders, for businesses, for households, for different levels of government, what's their return on investment, what are their costs, what are the impacts in terms of quality of life for different measures. In this case, we're looking at smart growth and transit-oriented development with some green infrastructure measures in there as well. We got a little critique from one economist reviewer saying, wait a minute, these are economic transfers among stakeholders. And I said, that's fine, but in this case, we don't want just one number, because I think political economy happens by stakeholders finding their own economic self-interest and then getting involved in the solution. So knowing those stories in a much shorter ways, identifying winners is important, and being able to have good analyses to do that will help us moving forward. So we, in the report, come up with some recommendations on research and analysis, again, on economic analyses, on things, on risk management methods, and things like material vulnerability assessments, and importantly on capacity building, technical assistance throughout all the parts of the transportation planning process, planning, design, construction, guidance on selecting appropriate data and tools. You may have one model that helps you with sea level rise, another with surge, another with river flooding. How do you make these things work together in a way that's practical and effective for you? And then from a policy perspective, again, trying to integrate adaptation into transportation planning processes, into asset management, which I know is one of the important criteria for FHWA, and coming up with performance management guidelines. One of the encouraging outcomes of the workshop was that a lot of the skills already exist. So it's not some new kind of thing, like what do you do again for a flood event, for a heat event? And from practitioners' experience with emergency response, with flooding, with hazard mitigation, with land use planning, they have a lot of the skills they're going to need moving forward. And we took some solace in Mick Jagger's word that we can't always get what we want. We don't, the climate model is not going to give us all of the answers. We're not going to have the perfect data, but we can probably figure it out. And again, that informs my maybe. Can we get there from here? Dr. Mick Jagger thinks so. So what's new? This workshop was 2 years ago, and I'm humbled by how active this space has been, and I commend the Department of Transportation's leadership in this space. A number of reports and resources. If you go to AASHTO's website or Georgetown, there's a lot out there. I'm going to share a couple of highlights and encourage you to check out these resources yourself. FHWA's new vulnerability assessment framework came out, I guess, the end of last year. An important way to figure out what all the steps are in approaching this issue. And very importantly, FHWA and FTA together, I think, accounted more than 24 pilots with transit agencies, with states, with MPOs, going through these steps of impact analysis, vulnerability assessment. There are rich lessons to be gleaned from there. The Transportation Research Board, TRB's, been active in this space. There's a new report available online now, pre-publication, format that Mike Myers at Georgia Tech led, practitioner's guide on climate change and the highway system. It's going to be accompanied by a software tool that to do decision support analysis, and I recommend that resource. Engineers Canada has a vulnerability infrastructure vulnerability committee that's recently come out with an engineering protocol that I also recommend. So we look more on the kind of the policy perspective. It's a 500-page report out of New York City, the Plan YC for a stronger, more resilient New York. Had tons and tons of policy recommendations, I think at least a dozen in transportation. One that really caught my eye was integrating climate resiliency into future capital projects. This is just asking the climate question. You're going to spend money, take a look. Are you putting it in the floodplain? What kind of design might be needed? Is it concrete that's going to last for 50 years? Remember a couple of years ago, New York City went down to Atlanta and say, what kind of concrete mixes are you using? Because we may have more of your climate in a few decades, and we'd like to not have to replace the concrete in that time frame. So asking the climate question with investments. The Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Task Force, importantly, working around locally driven solutions and bringing together all the different federal players, bringing together the different state agencies, the local agencies, and the private sector to figure out solutions. It sounds trite, but we all know the alphabet soup of agencies and different policy directions becomes really important. If we can focus those, we can make a lot of progress. The President's Action Plan, which Greg mentioned also, essentially talks about asking the climate question, integrating climate risk management into infrastructure planning and investment, and importantly, developing a toolkit for climate resilience, very much in line with what the practitioners in our workshop called for. And the STRONG Act, which is originally introduced by Senator Kerry before he got promoted, I guess, strengthening the resiliency of our nation on the ground. It was actually started by a section in the Senate Transportation Bill where Senator Kerry's office contacted us after we published this report saying, what kind of capacity building is needed on transportation? So we had plenty to say there. This talks about looking at gap and overlap analysis of federal resiliency efforts, where there are synergies, where there are conflicts, developing an action plan, and again, providing that capacity building to empower and equip state and local private decision makers to enhance resiliency. It was proposed by Senator Gillibrand in the Senate, Representative Peters in the House, and obviously they're not working on it today. Public service announcement for some colleagues at Georgetown. Jessica Granis over there is doing some work for FHWA, looking for examples of transportation adaptation activities at states and MPOs, and also some work they're doing for the Kresge Foundation, trying to understand what federal resources are needed by states and locals, what's already out there, what kind of barriers are they running into, can the MAP 21 risk management plans be helpful there. There's an email on this. You can send those types. I'll copy me. I'd be very interested. And again, the presentation will be online if you can jot that down in time.